Over the past few months, I noticed my workflow starting to slow down while video editing because I'm adding more camera angles and more complicated motion graphics. And so I thought it was time for an upgrade. In this video, I'm gonna walk through the parts that I chose for this PC. I'm gonna set it up, and then I'm gonna walk through the benchmarks for this latest PC build. Now keep in mind, I'm running 6K BRAW for my main camera on the Blackmagic Pocket CinemaCam 6K, and two 4K Fujifilm cameras H.264, plus motion graphics, so I needed enough performance to run all of those smoothly in my timeline. I'm not doing anything crazy like red footage, and so this build resembles what I need for my specific workflow. So if that sounds something like you, then this build will be spot on. Now, without the sponsors of this video, this build would have been impossible. So I'm gonna give a huge shout out to Asus for the motherboard and GPU. I'm gonna give a big shout out to Intel for the CPU, BenQ for the awesome 4K color accurate Pantone verified monitor, TeamGroup for sponsoring the RAM, Kingston for the SSD, and of course Bequiet for the beautiful case, fan, power supply, and the internal fans of the system. So huge shout out to the sponsors. I'm super grateful for y'all for sponsoring this build. Now let's go ahead and rewind the clock and kick off with a PC build. Kicking things off, the foundation of this system is the Asus ProArt B660 Creator D4. Around $240 at the time of recording, but of course all parts and components are gonna be listed in the description below, so you can check out the live pricing. You actually get 3 months free of Adobe Creative Cloud with the purchase of this motherboard. The ports on the back come with DisplayPort, HDMI 2.1, that's 4K at 60 Hertz, 4 USB 2.0, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1, 1 USB-C 3.2, and that is also a display port. You have 2.5 gigabyte and 1 gigabyte Ethernet, and of course your standard audio jacks. Now, we're complementing that with the Intel i7-12700. This is not the K, this is just the straight 12700 CPU. Roughly $400 at the time of recording. This comes with 12 cores. So we have performance cores base frequency of 2.10 gigahertz, efficiency cores base frequency of 2.10 gigahertz. And this also comes with 20 threads. So 12 core, 20 thread processor. And we're gonna go ahead and get the CPU installed, and then we're gonna do the M.2 drives, and then we will install our RAM configuration. Now, first and foremost, as you are installing your CPU, just make sure you set the CPU in gently. You don't wanna try and force it in, you'll bend the pins here on the motherboard. So we're gonna go ahead and get the CPU added in. Pull off the protector, let our CPU. And we're going to just ever so gently lay the CPU in place. There we go. All right, now from there, just go ahead and set that down on top and lock it into place. Good to go, easy as that. Now let's go ahead and install our drives. Now there's gonna be 2 drives in this system. You can go for 3. Now 2 drives is good, 3 drives is optimal. With 2 drives, you wanna have your OS installed on a smaller 500 gigabyte drive. That's enough space for your operating system, all your applications, and whatever extra else lands on your PC over the next couple of years. So for this one, we're just having a 500 gig Western Digital Black series, and this is where our OS and all of our apps will live on. And then we have our actual storage drive where your working files for your projects will end up on them. And this is the Kingston Renegade, and this is a 2 terabyte drive. Now this storage is super fast. The reason I went for this is it actually has transfer speeds of up to 7,300 megabytes per second read speed and 7,000 megabytes per second write speed. The reason to separate those two out is so each drive runs its specific function. The OS drive is a nice clean drive full of just the OS and the different apps. This one is what you're working off of, saving your files to. And then if you want to add a third drive, that's where I would add your cache files. So whenever you're working in Premiere Pro or any sort of creator apps, your program is constantly caching files. And if you are caching files onto your actual drive or you're saving and working through your projects, it starts to slow it down and kind of fill it up unnecessarily. So by creating a third cache drive, you're freeing up your system to run even faster. So that's why I recommend a third drive, but I have 2 for this build, and I'll probably add a third one later. Now, the first thing I'm gonna do is take off the heatsink and install my working drive into this M.2 PCIe 4.0 slot. And easy as pie, just go ahead, slide this in. You can't really see it underneath there, but it just slides right in. And the awesome thing about these Asus boards is you just go ahead and turn that little switch and it's good to go. No screws required. All right, next, we'll pull out the Western Digital black drive. And this one is so thin. Crazy how thin this drive is. It's like just paper thin. Really cool. All right, now I'm gonna pull off the heat sink here. So also make it easier whenever I wanna install that third one. Just slide that one right in later. This one you can see better. It just drops right into this spot right there. Open. And that installs there. Go ahead and drop these heat sinks back on. Want to make sure you remove the plastic off of the heat pad. Otherwise, you'll be melting plastic onto your storage drive. Possibly melting plastic. Not a guarantee, but very well possible. Okay, drives are in. Now let's go ahead and install the RAM. We have a dual RAM configuration from TeamGroup. They sent us over 16 gigs of RAM. This is a good starting point if you're editing, 1080p and some 4K. But honestly, I would go ahead and grab a 32 gig set from TeamGroup. That would be my top recommendation. You can get DDR4 at 3200 megahertz, CL16, 20, 20, 40, and this is a 10-layer board. It'll just give you more ceiling when working inside of creator apps such as Premiere Pro, Photoshop, DaVinci Resolve, whatever you might be doing. So this is a 16 gig set, but I would definitely recommend 32. Now you wanna make sure that you're setting your RAM into your motherboard in the correct configuration. Okay, so a lot of times they want you to separate them, and sometimes it's listed in your user guide, and sometimes it's listed right on the motherboard. Okay, and usually what you wanna do is 1A, 1B. Okay, and as you can see right here on the motherboard, we have that set up. So you want 1A, to 1B. So you go ahead and pull your tab out, make sure the notches line up. Good. It's not installed yet. And then 1A and then 1B. Good. And then just push down firmly. And those will snap into place. So good to go. It's amazing how fast you can actually get one of these systems together. So we have our drives in, our CPU, and our RAM that quickly. Now the next thing we want to do before moving on any further is getting the plate for the CPU mount on the back of the motherboard. So that way when we get this motherboard into the case, we can easily mount the air cooler into the system. Let's go ahead and pull out our air cooler. We're going with the Dark Rock 4. And I choose an air cooler personally because for the ease of installation, the ease of maintenance, and it's just a lower cost option. The cooling performance is 200 watts of TDP. Now, in my opinion, I think a air cooler is the perfect amount of cooling. You're not spending too much money on expensive AIOs. You're not wasting your money there. You can take that money, maybe put it into some more RAM. So if this air cooler goes out, you're not gonna have to worry about any of your AIO fluid leaking. You don't have to worry about an expensive upgrade. You don't have to worry about the fact of, hey, is my AIO still pumping water? Is it still cooling my system? Now you will notice it will get very hot, obviously, but if you're not paying attention, you just look into your system and see, oh, my fans aren't like running and circulating. So you can kind of tell if it goes out easier. And replacing this is super simple. You just pop off 4 screws, pull it out, $75, and you're back on the road. So that's why I personally prefer air coolers, just the ease of use when it comes to running your system. Bequiet makes it really easy when it comes to installing your cooler. They have these neat little bags just with the name on it, Intel versus AMD. And it even comes with some thermal paste, which I will use. So this goes ahead and sits on the back of our motherboard. And then we put the screws through to hold it in place. I definitely recommend these metal plates. Make it so easy to make sure you don't lose any of your very important parts. One, So as many as you can get going, because once you flip it over, it makes it very difficult to put your screws on. So what I do is I was able to get 2 in there, so I'm gonna just go ahead and twist these first 2 on. All right, so once you get the headers in, you can go ahead and grab the crossbars and set those in place, which is where your actual air cooler will mount to. And I know I'll have tons of feedback on why maybe I should have used an AIO, or why air cooler was such a good idea, or plenty of opinions will be shared, I am sure. Now, one thing you actually can do, and personally, this is what I've done in the past. Now, it makes it a little tricky once you're in there getting all the screws from the motherboard into the actual case. Sometimes I'll actually install my cooler outside of the case, because then as far as applying the thermal paste goes, it makes it a lot easier. And then I'll put my fan on after. So then I'll clip the fan on after that point. So I'm actually gonna do that. I'm gonna go ahead and get the cooler in, and then I'm gonna go ahead and put this in the case. It also gives you a nice, you know, extra area to kind of hold on and secure it, because it's hard to sometimes get your hands in and drop the motherboard in just gently. And because this is mounted so securely to these standoff plates, that's why I like putting in the cooler beforehand. So we're gonna go ahead and do that real quick. We have some thermal paste, which came from our good friends at Bequiet. So go ahead and I'll do a line down the center, like so. Do a few dots here on the side. There we go. You wanna make sure you have a nice amount of thermal paste. There we go. Okay. There. And then what we want to do is you want to have your mounting bracket ready to go. And make sure, of course, your cooler is facing the right direction. And just go ahead and set it. Set it in place. Perfect. Just like that. Gotta move it a tiny bit. Okay. All right, so we got the cooler mounted to the motherboard. Now I'm gonna go ahead and mount the fan to the side of the cooler, and then we'll place the motherboard into the case here in just a moment. But first, gotta find my fan. And we're going to drop this on the side here. You wanna make sure that you line the cord up somewhere where the fan is going to plug in. So I'm gonna go ahead and find my CPU fan. Okay, so here we go. So the gray one, CPU fan, that's what we want to plug into. There we go. That went in just fine. And then I'm going to go ahead and mount it like that. Now luckily there's little arrows here. And you want to make sure the air is pushing towards the arrows. So see if I can tilt that around a little bit. There's the little arrows there that tell you the direction. So you want to mount the fan where the air is pushing through the cooler. So right about there. I'm gonna mount this slightly above. And there we go. Okay. Should grab the right coils. And then these will just clip right in like so. Come around the other side. And clip these in. All right, so there you go. Our fan is in place, good to go. And now we can go ahead and pick the motherboard up and set it into the case. Now the case is the Bequiet Pure Base 500DX, roughly $110 at the recording of this video. I absolutely love these cases. I personally would not use any other case to build my PCs. They're compact, they're quiet, and they're just so functional. Now this comes with 3 +1 Pure Wings fans. The +1 is an extra fan that I added to get more air through the machine. Now, the connecting ports on the front, you have a USB 3.2 Gen 1 and a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C. Having the ability to pick this up is very, very nice. Getting this thing in gently is never an easy chore. Okay. Make sure we line up with that center post, otherwise your motherboard will not drop in. Once we can get it. There we go, perfect. All right, so it's lined up with that center post. It drops right in very nicely. You can't see it underneath the fan. Let's see if I can tilt it up a little bit. Right there, yeah. So right under here, there's that center post on your case. So as long as that drops in, all of your screws will go in neatly. The motherboard will sit flat. The first time I actually ever installed a motherboard into a case, I fried the motherboard because it was slightly tilted, and it literally caught fire and smoked and burnt up. So you want to make sure, just warning, don't be too concerned, but just make sure your motherboard's sitting nice and flat. And that center post will make sure that each of the screws is sitting flat and it sits down nicely. Then it'll make sure it starts up and has no issues as well. All right, go ahead and pop all these screws in, and then we'll keep moving down the road. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and install, now I'm gonna go ahead and install 2 more fans on the front of the case. So we'll go ahead and pull this off from the bottom here. You can't be scared when you're pulling that off. I always feel like I'm gonna break it. When it comes to this case, you just gotta give it a good yank. All right, and this comes off here. That pulls off. So we're gonna go ahead and put these on here, these little accessory pieces, and that'll allow us to screw the fan to the front plate. All right, so now that we have those pieces on, I'm gonna go ahead and slide this fan up to where it's almost touching, but just before. Then I'm gonna add the bolts into the back here. All right, so I got the fans in place, so those are good to go. I'm gonna go ahead and put the cover back on, and then from there, we will go ahead and add power supply into the build, and then we'll put the GPU in, and then we'll be about ready to get this thing fired up. 1, 2, 3. Now the power supply is the Bequiet Pure Power 11FM 750 watt, roughly $110 at the recording of this video. The peak power is around 820 watts. The voltage is anywhere from 100 to 240 volts. This is an 80+ gold efficiency power supply, and it is a modular cable system. So go ahead and spin it around. And what we're gonna wanna do is take off these back brackets, because this is what we'll mount the power supply to. So these will come off. And we'll also take off the back plate. We'll take off the back plate of the whole case. Don't need this for a little while. Go. All right, so now you can see all of our back is revealed, so we can go ahead. This fan, there's the fan cord we push through. So that'll plug in into the motherboard for power. But right now we need to go ahead and get the cords hooked into the power supply, and then we'll mount on the tray to the actual power supply. We can actually probably just do that right now while we're looking at it. All right. I like to put them all in first before I crank them down. If there's any give or play, it easily shifts around, and then each of the screws can go in without any fuss. Sometimes if you get them too tight, too quick, then one of the screws doesn't fit, yada yada. So I like to get them all in first on most things that I'm doing, and then you tighten them down. Good. Okay. So that's good to go. That'll slide in here in just a second. Let's turn our case around. Let's go ahead, and we have on our hands here the motherboard power. So this will power the motherboard. The CPU power. So we'll run to the CPU, of course. We have our GPU, which is our PCIe here. And then this is our SATA. So this will be for powering the color RGB on the front, as well as the front panel. And that's what this will be for. And then also, if you have any extra hard drives that you want to plug in, like an actual thicker SATA drive rather than the M.2. This is what you would use for that. So go ahead and get these hooked in real quick. And then for this, we want to make sure we're going to the PCIe. And then actually, when you hook into your GPU, the cord is separated, but you want to plug in the full, I think this is a 12, if I'm not mistaken, in here. Yeah, it's 12. So on the motherboard, we have slightly separated. So as you can see, we plug into the bottom one, and then we have the 8 on the top. So you see it goes there and there. And then of course our SATA drops right in there, and then we're good to go on that one. Okay, now we'll go ahead and stuff all our cords in here. You always want to make sure you have the fan facing down. I'm going to be pulling air in the bottom of the system. And that's why you don't want to put your system on carpet. You want to make sure your system is set up on some sort of tables, some sort of stand, or on a table. I actually hang mine under my desk on a PC mount that I built for under my standing desk. But then you want to make sure you're pulling air from the underneath the chassis or case. I'm so used to talking about laptops on this channel. Forgive me. Painless, quick and easy. Got that in. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and start wiring up some of this real quick. And we want to wire up before we get the GPU in, because if we get the GPU in and then we start wiring up, the GPU can kind of get in the way. So I'm just going to push this through. This will actually be our GPU cable here. So that'll hook in right there. So I'm going to pull in a little bit of that slack. I'm going to leave our SATA out of the back. This is for our CPU. This will actually run up through here and plug in up here. But actually, you know what, first, let's run this one through. This is for the motherboard. Here. It's a big old cable. So we pull that through that one and I lay it down flat. Lay it down real quick. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the CPU cable. And it's tucked way up in there. This is probably the worst cable of the entire build. I always hate putting this cable in with a passion because it is in the worst location on any PC build. This fan's usually in the way. So what'll probably have to happen is I'm gonna hook it in and then come back to you because this usually takes me a while. So I'll be back. It's up there. You're gonna have to figure it out and finagle it yourself. Watching me, I don't have any secret special trick. It's just working with the system. So in order to get that in, I had to pull this fan out and then, you know, kind of move it over, move it out of the way. I was able to get the cord in and then put the fan back in and reinstall everything. So the CPU plug is in. Now I'm going to plug in the motherboard real quickly here. Plugs in without any issue there. I'll go ahead and tuck that cord in and get it all neat later. I want to make sure we plug in all the other fans and different headers that need to be plugged in. So let's go ahead and do that and then we'll move forward. All right, so we're all wired up, tested the power, and it looks like we got good power in going into the system from the power supply. So now we're going to go ahead and hook the GPU in, which I'm very excited about. Have the RTX 3050. Decided to go with a little bit more of a budget-friendly GPU since prices are still pretty high on GPUs. Now it comes with a GDDR6 VRAM of 8 gigabytes. The engine clock is at 1890 megahertz. The CUDA cores are 2560. The memory speed is 14 gigabytes per second, and the memory interface is 128 bit. When I looked at the current market value of this GPU, the RTX 3050, it was about $430. So, you know, a little higher than a few years back, just because we're trying to get those prices back down from all the scalping that took place. But $430 is not half bad. I think this total build, I added up the cost of the build. Total build was around $1,795. Now, the SSDs that I used were on the more expensive side, being that I wanted really fast read and write speeds. So you could probably save around $200 by going for slightly slower SSDs. That's what I would do, and I would probably go for maybe slightly slower SSDs and 32 gigs of RAM if you're trying to save some money on your build. let's go ahead and get this thing mounted in. To do that, what you need to first do though, before we try and mount it, is line up where the GPU is going to sit and where it's going to come out of the back plate. As you can see through here, come out of the back plate of the case. So what I'll do is I'm gonna line it up here, and it looks like it's going to be at 2 and 3. And so I'll go ahead and I will remove 2 and 3. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and mount it in. 2 and 3. Pull this plate out. Then this actually comes off here. You can loosen this up just to make it easier to get your GPU in and out. So it's kind of slides over to give you some space, which is really nice. This little piece here, so we can turn that, check it out. So this piece loosens up, so you can slide that. I really like that feature. So we're gonna loosen that up, slide it over, and now we're gonna go ahead and mount the GPU into place. Make sure those pieces line up. We are in place. We can actually, if we want to be really handy, take this whole plate off. That gives us a whole bunch more room. All right, so GPU's in place. Now we're gonna go ahead and pull the cable through. And we're in. It's a little plastic. And that is a nicely installed RTX 3050. All right, so now that we got all the parts installed, let's go ahead, turn on the PC and see if we can get to the BIOS. If we can, that means we are good to go, no issues, and we can move on to benchmarking this thing. Once again, I want to thank Bequiet for sponsoring this video and sending over their latest 27-inch model. This is 99% sRGB, 4K screen, Pantone validated display. So super stoked to have this a part of the build. Let's go ahead and get fired up. That's a good sign. It's always a good sign when everything turns on first. And we're in. So everything's been installed correctly. Let's go get to those benchmarks. Jumping into the performance benchmarks, you're gonna see a few laptops on the charts, as well as my old PC build, which is the Ryzen 9 3900X. As we jump into Geekbench single core, you can see that it's really not a competition between my older PC build and this newest Intel i7-12700. As we get into multi-core in Geekbench, the results get quite a bit closer. Ryzen, back when this processor came out, was really the top dog of multi-core processing. So to see that Intel has come over the top of them, for me personally in this build, is an improvement for my personal workflow, which makes me really excited about these benchmarks. Now moving into some real world tests, let's check out After Effects, where I gained a substantial increase in performance. I'm now scoring an 853 inside of After Effects as opposed to the prior 521. So a big boost in performance inside of After Effects. Now moving on to Photoshop, again, I saw a substantial boost in performance, over a 100-point increase in performance. Now keep in mind that my current build at which I benchmarked this PC was 64 gigs of RAM in the Bequiet compared to 16 gigs of RAM in my new build. Now I went ahead and added another 16 gigs of RAM to this build and ran the benchmark again and saw a 1,125 out of this system. So a much bigger increase in performance than even with just the 16 gigs of RAM. So if I got this up to 64 gigs of RAM, we would see even higher results out of Photoshop. Photoshop really likes RAM, and so when you're running 64 gigs versus 16 gigs, and it still beat it, and then I added 32 gigs and it beat it substantially, I can't wait to see what this system will do with 64 gigs. Now TeamGroup was super kind to send over 16 gigs of RAM, but if I were you, I'd go ahead and get a TeamGroup 32 gig set of RAM if you're going and considering this build, especially for video editing. And I'm gonna show you why right now. With 16 gigs of RAM, the playback still did good with this PC. On 6K BRAW, we dropped about 554 frames out of 16,177 in a 6K BRAW 9-minute project. However, as soon as I added the extra 16 gigs into the system, we went to 0 drop frames in BRAW and 0 drop frames in red footage. And that is compared to the older 3900X build that I had with 64 gigs of RAM. We saw drop frames out of BRAW at 1,964 and red footage 3,621. And so you can see that the system is already more powerful, and even at just 16 gigs of RAM and then 32. And so it's a big upgrade for me, and I'm really excited to have more power in the studio. So if you're somebody who's considering this type of setup with the RTX 3050 and the i7-12700 for 6K and 4K video editing, it's totally enough power. And this build comes in at around $1,800 or less. Now, the reason it was a little bit more expensive is because of those Kingston drives that are super fast read and write speeds. So if you went for something a little more budget friendly on the drive landscape, you could get this build below $1,700, which would be a great mid-range budget PC build. Definitely let me know in the comment section below what you think of this PC build, changes you maybe would have made if building this PC yourself. Again, I want to thank Asus, TeamGroup, Bequiet, Intel, Kingston, and Bequiet for sponsoring this video and making it happen. Links in the description below of all the products. If you're ready to make a purchase or interested in the live pricing, likes of this video has brought you some value, and subs if you don't want to miss out on the future uploads. I'll see y'all here in the next one.